have a blog application here which has many article records. Now this site also supports internationalization, which allows the user to change the language that's displayed on the site. So here you can see there's an option to translate it into WookieSpeak. So clicking that changes the title articles here to native WookieSpeak. You can see English says articles and WookieSpeak says that. However, you can see the article content itself did not change. That is still displayed in English. So how do we change the database content depending on the user's selected language? Well, the way internationalization is normally done is through YAML files. You can see under the config locales directory I have here, there's an English YAML file and a WookieSpeak YAML file, which contains the translated text. For more information on this approach, watch episode 138. While this technique does work well for static text that would normally be in the view template, it won't help us with dynamic text generated from the database. For that, we'll need to store the translations in the database instead. And we can use the Globalize3 gem to help us do this. It makes it easy to create a separate table to store the translations, and then it will automatically switch to the proper translation depending on the user's currently selected locale. So to use this in our application, just go to the bottom of the gem file and then add the Globalize3 gem into there, and then you'll need to run the bundle command to install it. And then next, go into the model you want to translate, in this case the article model, and call translates and pass it the names of the columns you want to translate, such as the name and content column in this case. Now we still need to create the database table to store these translations, and you can see in the README here, you could just call create translation table inside of the same migration where you create the table for the model. However, if you already have a model set up with data inside of it like I do here, you may choose this alternative approach where you can create a separate migration and call create translation table there and specify to migrate the data. That's what I'll do here. So I'm going to run this command to generate a new migration and call it create article translations. There we go. And then I just need to edit this migration to match what is shown in the README. I'm just going to paste in some content into here where I call create translation table on the article model and then pass in the columns that I want to be able to translate. In this case, a name column, which is a string type, and the content column, which is a text type. So this data will be stored inside of this translation table instead of the original articles table, and then I tell it to migrate the data. So I'll just run rake-db migrate to create that translation table. And now let me show you how this works inside the console. Now if you take a look at the current I18N locale, you can see it's at its default, which is English. And if we fetch the first article and get its name, you can see that works and we get Superman. Now what if we change the locale to WookieSpeak instead, and then try to fetch the first article's name, and we get nil as the response instead because there's no translation for WookieSpeak. Now Globalize3 overrides both the getter and setter behavior for the columns and scopes it to the current translation. So that means if I update the attribute for the name and set it to something like that, then it will insert a record into the article translations for that WookieSpeak value. So if I try fetching the first article name again, I get this in response. But then changing the I18N locale to English again will now display the English name. Now let's see this in action on the site. You may need to restart your Rails application, but once you do and hit reload, the English version should look the same because that data was migrated over. But if we go to WookieSpeak here, you can see it's pretty much blank. We do have our name that we set in the console, but all of the other attributes we set up for the translation will be nil. However, we can go in and edit one of these articles now and then fill it in with the proper translated text. There we go. That content looks good. And now if I update this article here, you can see it has that content, or if I go to the English version, it has the English version still. So we have multiple languages here being properly translated. And what's kind of neat, if we go to the edit form again, we can easily update whichever translation we want by changing the language here. Now keep in mind, if you change an attribute which you did not set up for translation, like this author attribute here, I'll change this, and then when we update it, it will update all of the translation languages because it's in the actual articles table and not the article translations table. Now translating all of the database records into each language can be quite a task, and right now it's going to just return nil values for those attributes, so you may want to provide some kind of fallback instead. To do this, just go to the application config file and add an option here called i18n.fallbacks. and then set that to true. So this way, any translations which are not specified in that language will fall back to the default locale, in this case is English. Now you'll need to restart the application after making that change, but once you do and hit reload, you can see any content that we did not translate has fallen back to English. Well, that's it for this episode on using Globalize3 to translate database records. Thanks for watching. In this week's Pro episode, I continue our look into deployment and show you the basics of Chef Solo. Now, I'm still working on finishing up this episode, so it's not yet available, but expect it sometime later on this week. To watch that episode and all other Pro and Revised episodes, just head on over to railscast.com/pro and then sign up there for just $9 per month. As a developer, writing copy is not my cup of tea. Take this headline for example. Should it say browse our products, or product listing, or maybe just products? And same goes for the description underneath. And what's worse is that this text isn't very easy to change. Someone who has access to the source code needs to actually edit the HTML and then issue a redeploy, just to change a little wording. Instead, it would be nicer if there was some kind of easy-to-use admin interface where even the client could go in and edit the copy. And that brings us to Copycopter. This provides a nice interface where the client can do the editing, and it has a Ruby gem that you can use to integrate easily into a Rails application. So this used to be a paid service, but Thoughtbot recently open sourced it, so it's free for you to use. Let me show you how. First, you'll need to set up the Copycopter server. So this is a complete Rails application that provides the interface for editing the copy. So this is not a mountable engine, which means you'll need to deploy and host this separately from your main Rails application. Fortunately, Heroku is a perfect fit for this. Copycopter will work nicely on one dyno, so you can host it for free here. Just go to Heroku.com and click Sign Up to get started. After you complete the sign-up process, you'll need to install the Heroku toolbelt, which provides a command line interface for managing your apps. Just select your operating system, download it, and then run the installer. After it's done installing and you open a new terminal window, you'll have access to the Heroku command where you can type Heroku login and then your credentials to set it up for this system. There we go, now we're authenticated, so let's deploy Copycopter server to Heroku. If you check out the GitHub project, you'll find some documentation in the README for deploying it to Heroku. I'll be following these commands here. First, I'll clone the project onto my local machine here, and then change into that directory. And now we're ready to deploy to Heroku by running this command provided by the README. Now, depending on your setup, you may get an error like I just did here. To solve this, we can run bundle install, and you may want to run this without the test environment to reduce the number of gem dependencies. Now we can try running that command again to set up Heroku. Now the way Heroku works is you deploy using git, so we can run git push Heroku master to deploy the application. And next we can run migrations on the server using Heroku run rake db migrate. And then run Heroku restart. And now we can make a Copycopter project by running this command. We just have to fill in the variables. So I'll give this project a name of store, and for my username, I'll do Ryan B, and for the password, I'll just do secret. Now let's check out the site we just deployed by running Heroku open. So this opens it up in the browser, and you can see it's running on Heroku. And if we click on Store here to access our project, we'll get authentication dialog where we type in our credentials that we typed in earlier. And then it tells us that we don't have a Rails application set up for this project yet, but it gives us some nice instructions for setting it up. We just have to add this to our gem file and then add an initializer with this content in it. So let's follow those instructions and add Copycopter to this store application. So I'll just go into the gem file for this app, and then at the bottom here, I'll just paste in the content that it was provided for adding the Copycopter client gem. And then you'll need to run the bundle command to install it. And then under the config initializers directory, I'll make a new file under here called copycopter.rb. And this is where the configuration code goes that was provided to hook up our Rails application to the Copycopter server that was deployed. So now with Copycopter set up, we just need to make this headline and this tagline underneath editable through Copycopter. To do this, go into the view template and replace the text with a call to the T method and pass in some kind of unique key to identify it. So let's call this products.headline. And then we can also pass in a default value just in case it's not set through a copycopter. Now this T method is actually Rails' built-in internationalization, and that's what copycopter goes through. So you can use copycopter to do translations on your site as well. Now let's do the same thing we have here, but I want to show you something a little bit different, and that is you can pass in a relative key in here by prefixing it with a period. So we could say a tagline here, and the key will be prefixed with the path to the template, so it'll be unique to this template. So let's also pass in a default value of what was there before. Now you may need to restart your application to load in copycopter, but once you do and then reload the page, it should look the same because it's using the default values. But now when we visit our copycopter project again, we get a search dialog where we can search for a key. So let's type in a headline, and then we can see there's that products.headline key we set up with the value of browse products. So we can replace this with, let's say, browse our products instead. Now you have the option to either make it a draft or publish it. So publishing it will make it visible in the production environment. A draft will not. So we can just make it a draft. So let's save the blurb. And since we're running in development, I'll just reload this page here. And there it says browse our products instead of browse products. It works. Next, let's do a search for the tagline. And there's our tagline translation that we added, and notice that it's prefixed with products.index because we started it with a period in our Rails application. And also I want to point out that you can make different things bold or italic, and you can also change the locale here if you want to choose a different language to translate it into. So this is really neat. It's a nice little way to edit your copy for your Rails app. Now one copycopter server can manage multiple projects, so if you have another site, you can just add it as a separate project to copycopter by running this command again and just changing the values. Well, that's it for this episode on copycopter. So if you're tired of editing your copy and having to redeploy each time, give it a try. In the Pro episode this week, I continue our look into deployment and show you how to make Capistrano recipes to help manage your server setup. This way you can deploy a server completely from scratch in just a few commands. To watch that episode and all other Pro and Revised episodes, just head on over to railscast.com/pro and then sign up there for just $9 per month.